Hello, and welcome to module number 2. Today, we're going to be talking about culture creation and sociological analysis. So basically, analyzing where new culture comes from a sociological standpoint. We're going to start by covering the Byrne reading and digging into what I'm calling David Byrne's creation thesis. We're going to explore an example of this by looking at how the transition to streaming as like the predominant way that we consume music, how streaming has influenced the creation of songs, and we can specifically see that in the way that their structures have changed. After that, we're going to go into a bigger sociological theory of where new culture comes from, specifically where cultural innovations come from. So, where new cultural practices or artistic styles originate. So, how social groups and other sociological phenomenon have a hand in contributing to the development of cultural innovations. So we'll look at examples of the origin of Impressionism, which happened in like 1860 to 1890, and then the emergence of freestyle BMX as like an art form and a professional sport, which happened throughout the 1980s into around 2005. And there's surprising kind of similarities in the origins of both Impressionism as a style of painting and freestyle BMX as a kind of like an individual sport and a style of expression in some ways or another. At the end, we'll talk about the first assignment. So if you want to start thinking about that, we're going to be focusing on the origin of a subgenre. So in the way that we're looking, or the way that we're engaging collaborative circles theory today to talk about the origin of Impressionism as like a genre of painting, and BMX as a genre of doing things with bikes, or a genre of sport. Think about a genre of music that you're or specifically, sorry, a subgenre of music. So in the way that, trying to think of an example off the top of my head here, the in the way that say like conscious hip hop is to hip hop, right? There's like it's a subvariant of this larger genre. I'm sure a few of them come to mind to you immediately. So think about genres that you prefer, or ones maybe that you're curious about and are interested in exploring or learning a little bit more about, because this assignment will give you an opportunity to do that. Also, before I get into the content of the course, like I mentioned, we'll be covering historical examples, the BMX and painting and music consumption. I just wanted to mention, like, it's not necessary to memorize all the names and the details of the stories that I'm going to be telling. This isn't a history class, it's a sociology class, so the takeaway should be sociological. So the reason why I'm presenting all of these details and different stories is so that we can see parallels between things that don't really seem that connected, and that will help us to kind of see how these sociological units of analysis are influencing the phenomena that we're talking about. So yeah, it's more important that you understand how context, social contexts, shape creation and cultural innovation than it is to remember, say, all of the names of the Impressionist painters. I wouldn't ask you to do that. Okay, so yeah, let's move forward here. Okay, let's start by talking about David Byrne. So, if you're not familiar, David Byrne was the frontman of a band called the Talking Heads. In their time, they were a pretty innovative rock band. If you're not familiar with their music, I'd suggest to go check it out and listen to a couple of their songs or watch a couple of their music videos. David Byrne himself has had a considerable kind of cultural legacy. He's not only been the frontman of a influential band, but he's gone on to produce plays and have a hand in films, and I believe he's written novels, so fiction and nonfiction. So pretty creative guy. But let's talk about his creation thesis. So to put it simply, he says that we create work that fits the venue available to us. And I think that's a pretty impressive argument, the way he kind of weaves these different facets of context that are important to shaping music. So not only is it important to make music that entertains our friends or the audience that's in front of us, but the physical space where we're making music actually shapes music that we make, or the music that people can stand to listen to in that space, right? So I think there's a pretty sharp contrast when he talks about the difference between using drums uh, in outdoor spaces and the use of kind of slow, harmonious chants in, say, church spaces. So, um, when he's talking about that, he's talking about like there's this quote here that the instruments or the things that the sounds that people are making are carefully fashioned, they're selected, tailored, and played to best suit the physical, acoustic, and social situation. So this is a sociological argument because we're talking about how the audience actually has a hand in the thing that's created, and the physical space has a hand in the things that are created. And so these physical spaces, I mean, outside isn't constructed, isn't man-made, but an indoor space is inherently made by people. And the people who originally made that space may or may not have been concerned about the acoustic properties of the space, right? But nonetheless, those acoustic properties are going to shape the sounds that get made in there. So, right, like the difference between how drums sound outside, you can hear them from a long distance and the sound dissipates really quickly, versus, say, bringing a loud drum into a church space. There would be all of this reverberation, and maybe you could figure it out, but it would take time to figure out how to play that instrument so that um, the beat and the echo kind of fit together, and it might even be impossible based on the space. So to take David Byrne's point about how we create based on our physical location and social situation, I think it's worth considering um, other conventions that are important. I believe he does briefly mention this in the chapter, but we can think about the formats of music that, like, yeah, formats of music, right? So what do I mean by this? I mean the difference between listening to a music on a vinyl record versus a CD, versus a cassette, or yeah, a stream on through a streaming service. You can listen to the same song through all of these different formats or mediums, but these mediums have meaning, and these mediums are tied into the social world in important ways. If we're gonna link back some of these ideas to the previous module and the cultural diamond, we can talk about how there are predominant formats of music listening at different points in history. At some point, it was like the full length album. Before that, it was like a 45 record, so like a smaller one, and then a bigger record. And then we moved to CDs, which were smaller but could fit more information on them. And so these formats shaped the music that we made to it. So one of the classic arguments, or not arguments, but like observations here, is that when the music industry was first getting started in the 1940s, right? Like recorded music seems like something that's been around forever, but it's actually a fairly recent invention, right? Like it was just invented, I believe, in like 1890 was like the first sound recording, and it did not sound good. You would not want to listen to it. By the time it took, a good number of years, a good number of decades for people to work away at the sound recording. But so nonetheless, recorded music, it's so ingrained into our lives today that it seems like it's always existed. But It hasn't, and it's changed a lot throughout its existence. And, we weren't there to experience it, so we have to kind of rely on historical documents. But when music was first produced for mass consumption, it was produced on these records, right? 45 records. And that had a certain restrictions into simply like how long the song could be. So that shaped, it kind of had a maximum for songs, and that was around like 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And we still kind of have that convention. Actually, it's sort of changing because of streaming, which is the example that I want to use. So I'm going to just throw over to the first 10 minutes or so from this podcast called Switched on Pop. It's a few years old. I believe this was published in 2019, but the context hasn't really changed that much in the previous years. Obviously AI has been a big topic recently, which we're going to talk about. But in this example, they're talking about how the length and the structure of songs has changed in the age of streaming music, and how that has to do with concerns about how artists get paid and gain attention in the current economic and cultural context. Okay, so I'll throw over to that now.
Switched on Pop.
Welcome to Switched on Pop. I'm songwriter Charlie Harding.
And I'm musicologist Nate Sloan.
So Nate, have you noticed this anxiety that has overtaken pop music in the last 6 months?
Which one? I feel like pop is full of anxiety.
So according to many, the economics of streaming is changing music so significantly right now that pop may literally never sound the same again. And today I want to investigate these claims by seeing how musicians are altering their sounds to make it in today's streaming economy. And to do this, I've recruited Aisha Hassan and Dan Kopf, who have written about how streaming is affecting the sound of pop for Corte in a piece called The Reason Why Your Favorite Pop Songs Are Getting Shorter. Aisha and Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here.
This is exciting.
Yes.
It is.
Okay. So in a recent Guardian interview, mega pop producer Mark Ronson said that all your songs have to be under 3 minutes and 15 seconds because if people don't listen to them all the way to the end, they get into this ratio of non-complete herd, which sends your Spotify rating down and songwriters are forced to churn out hits at short order. So Aisha, can you untangle Ronson's gripe and explain what is causing so much concern?
So the way that many music streaming services work is that songs generate money per play. That means every time that they're streamed, they generate a certain amount of money, and that's very little. So it ranges between $0.004 to $0.008. And then if you don't play it to the very end and that rating goes down, meaning that people don't listen to the song through as much, then the song is less likely to make it into Spotify's really lucrative playlists, which get them streamed more. And because the amount of money is so little, volume is really important.
So this is obviously extremely different from how artists were paid in the past.
Right. I think it's important to note that artists right now, according to a report in 2017, they're only getting about 10% of the music industry's total revenue. But streaming is so important because that's how they're going to break out, right? And if they're not going to be heard by audiences, then less people are going to buy their tickets for their concerts, less people are going to buy their merch. So to be visible, it's really important to sometimes game the streaming system so more people listen to their stuff.
Okay, gaming the streaming system. Yeah. So there's some sort of perverse incentives going on in here. And just to sort of get a sort of order of magnitude around this, a CD used to cost, $15 to $20.
Right.
And how many songs do you have to stream in order to make the equivalent on an old record?
So 1,000 streams is equivalent of $6. So we're talking about 1,500 streams to get $9.
Whoa, and of course, and the artist probably is only making a fraction of those $9.
That's exactly right. The music services tend to take 30% of that revenue. So Spotify or Apple Music or whatever will take around 30%. And then even though you've got the rest of that money going to artists, depending on the deal that they have with record labels and the amount of people who have contributed to the track, that money, which is already very little at the beginning, is split up even more. So artists are actually getting a very, very small amount of money.
Okay, so this is interesting. I feel like we have two different issues at hand now that we have to deal with. One, as you mentioned, is this question of are songs getting shorter and sort of why? And then also, are there certain like time markers or boundaries that you have to fit within? Is that changing the way that perhaps people are writing music? And so let's take them in that order.
Great.
So are songs getting shorter?
Yes, definitely. So around 2000, the median length of a Billboard Hot 100 songs was well over 4 minutes, so about 4 minutes and 7 seconds. And in 2018, it was just over 3.5 minutes. So we've lopped off more than 30 seconds off the average Billboard Hot 100 songs. So that's quite a bit.
Fascinating. So Mark Ronson's anxiety that Charlie quoted at the beginning of this episode is perhaps warranted. Songs are getting shorter.
Yes, and there's also these extreme examples. So there are a bunch of songs now that are under 2.5 minutes long. So in the 2000s, there were virtually no songs under 2.5 minutes that made the charts. And in 2018, about 6% of them were less than 2.5 minutes, and some even just 2 minutes.
Yeah, you documented this in your piece, and there's like a hockey stick-like graph, basically starting in, I don't know, like
2015.
In 2015, all of a sudden,
Yes.
there's all of these songs that are now 2.5 minutes or shorter. You pointed to Kanye West and Lil Pump's I Love It, which comes in at just over 2 minutes long.
Wow.
Correct.
So the question, of course, is like, where is the music going? I'm curious, in your investigations, how much of this do you see is intertwined with the dominance of hip hop as the main form of today's popular music?
So that's a complicated thing to answer because, hip hop has seeped into all genres. So even when you listen to country, as you guys have pointed out in previous shows, country now has a hip hop effect. But if you look at every genre, they've all fallen. R&B, rock, pop, country, all of them have taken a big dive over the last 2 decades. Rap the most, so it's definitely the biggest phenomenon there. But it's not just a hip hop thing.
So on the one hand, we have some different incentive structures set up, and just to be clear about them, my understanding is we have songs are getting shorter because the way that you get paid with streaming is per song. And it used to be, since the age of album-oriented music, that the album was the main way that you made your money. And so now, if you're getting paid per song, it makes sense to have like 20 really short songs that might actually run shorter than an album length that would be 10 songs that are twice, 3 times as long. And so you're gaming, can I get as many songs in as possible? Is that an accurate description of how some people are understanding this?
Yeah. I just want to complicate things a little bit. So yes, we are pretty confident that streaming matters, but this is actually a pretty long-term trend. So if we look over the 20th century, you'll see that songs were quite short in the 40s and 50s, and then they got way longer through the latter half of the 20th century. And then starting around the late 1990s all the way up to today, we see songs shortening. So it's definitely got to be more than just streaming, but we're confident that sort of the effect that we're seeing over the last several years is a result of the desire to make more money from having shorter songs. And if somebody listens to an album repetitively, the artist will get more money. But there's definitely more going on there than just streaming.
Okay, so Spotify actually put out a press release about this phenomenon and said that in the world of digital consumption, our narrow windows of free time are the object of fierce competition by the seemingly limitless choices streaming platforms present. Short songs represent a solution to an audience's abundance of choice alongside endless opportunities for diversion. So there's sort of like a question of like, are audiences also driving this? That perhaps that's what they're suggesting. I think what we need to do, though, is examine the music and see, is this really going on? And I'm particularly interested in looking at like, if songs are getting shorter, what's being put on the chopping block? And so we established that hip hop is the most dominant form of pop music right now. You go on the Billboard, 60-70% of the charts are going to be hip hop. And if you also look at the songs which tend to be shorter, especially these sort of 2-minute, 2.5-minute songs, a lot of hip hop songs in there as well. And I think there's a part of this which makes sense because in hip hop, you don't necessarily have as rigid a structure of a pop song. You don't necessarily have to have, for example, a pre-chorus or a post-chorus or a bridge. You can just have hook, verse, and you're out. And so when you look at a song like Kanye West and Lil Pump's piece, they're doing exactly that.
When the first time they asked you want sparkling or still, are you trying to act like you was drinking sparkling water before you came out here? You're such a fucking, I'm a sick folk, I like a quick folk. I'm a sick folk, I like.
Let's do a 2-verse piece instead of, you go back to 90s hip hop, you might have had 3, 4, 5 verses in a song. So it's easy to just, you can chop it down, make more songs. That makes sense to me. I think where things get more complicated are when songs are using sort of more traditional verse-chorus song form. So if we look at a song like East Side, that song comes in at 2 minutes and 54 seconds, which is a pretty short pop song. And I wanted to look at just where's the extra music going. So let's take a listen to Benny Blanco's East Side, and we're going to listen to just what happens at the end.
Cool.
He used to meet me on the east side.
She used to meet me on the east side.
He used to meet me on the east side.
Okay, what did we just hear?
That I don't know.
An outro?
Outro. An
Yes,
outro.
I got it.
It's an outro. But here's the thing. The material that was leading before that outro was the bridge of the song. And there's like a pretty hard and fast rule. Nate, professor, what happens after a bridge?
You go back to the chorus.
You go back to the chorus. And so what they've actually done is they've just lopped off the final chorus, instead replaced it with an outro, which is the same material as the chorus, but you don't have that sort of big final bombastic moment. Instead, it's this sort of fading out moment. It's maybe appropriate for the song since this is a melancholy looking back on a relationship song, but I think we're missing the final 30 seconds of the song because they literally just don't have the final 2 choruses.
Yeah, it's like a bridge that just like goes directly into the ocean.
It's a bridge to nowhere.
Yeah. So that's one sort of victim of the perhaps streaming-driven shortening of pop songs, that they're getting a chorus that you might expect to hear at the end is getting chopped off.
That's right.
And replaced by just a little outro.
Okay, so as they explained over that during that podcast, they were talking about how the change from predominantly making money as a songwriter and a record label through album sales has changed to individual track streams. That has influenced the length of a song because you can optimize how much money you make if you make shorter songs. They didn't mention this, but one of the clearest examples of this is an album I really like by a songwriter or an artist called Tierra Whack. The album's called Whack World, and all of the tracks are 30 seconds long, which also at that time was the maximum video length that you could post on Instagram. So she had this like concept album where all of the tracks were about 30 seconds long, and all of the music videos could be posted to Instagram, and then she eventually kind of like stitched them all together into a short film that was the whole album. It's really cool. So anyway, that's kind of the way that people can be creative in relation to their context to kind of meet the demands of their context. And how how they can be creative to like fit their sounds into their social or cultural context. And I have the picture here on the top of the insect noises. This is from the Byrne reading, which is making a kind of similar point that in nature, animals kind of make space for each other to communicate in different using different sounds. So it might be kind of hard to read here, but these are higher and lower frequencies, which means like this is like a high, maybe tinny sound. Like think of like, cicadas or even just like banging on a tin roof, right? Like that's like high tinny sounds versus like say like a low bass guitar or like a low thump, right? That's like on the lower end here. And so that's the ups and downs. So you can see how there are some animals that are making like higher frequency noises and some that are making lower ones. And then I believe the left to right is just over time. So you can see that these animals are speaking at the same time. If you look at like one slice, they're like making noises at the same time, maybe not speaking, right? But they're making noises, communicating to each other. And they're at, different like slices of this frequency. And I don't know, just to kind of maybe clarify a little bit more, I'm sure if you've ever heard of like how dogs hear at a different frequency than us, like you can blow a whistle in which we can't hear it at all, but they would respond to it. So it's a similar kind of thing that some animals and insects communicate at higher frequencies, which maybe we can't hear, and maybe their predators can't hear as well, right? So things like that are relevant for the natural world. But if we look at the image on the bottom here, this is more important for, say, an aspiring musician or just somebody in the cultural industries. So it's kind of hard to make out here. But these are all different genres. So you can see country, folk, rockabilly over here. There's hard rock, punk, prog rock over here, grunge. So some of these are genres, some of these are subgenres. Remember, we're thinking about that throughout this class. But the point is that individuals who want to make cultural contributions tend to kind of find their niche in one or more of these genres, right? Like David Byrne, as I mentioned earlier, is probably an exception, that he's been so creative and influential across different formats, not just music, but writing and the theater and things like that. But artists and other people who make culture need to find what could be called like their sonic niche here, or even just their niche, depending on what the thing that is that they're creating. So from here, I want to transition into talking about kind of linking back to what we were talking about in the last module about sociological theories that emphasize either structure or agency. Thinking back onto David Byrne's creation thesis, it emphasizes structure, right? People are still agentic enough to make new things, but they're constrained in their ability to make new music, or we can generalize this to say like film genres and things like that. People are constrained in what they're able to make based on the context of, what's popular and how people consume. But what about innovation and change? Where does that come from? How can we explain for the emergence of a new genre in a world like in a kind of system like this, like say the genre systems that overlap in some ways and are distinct in some ways? How do we explain the creation of new cultural practices? Well, sociology has answers for us and comes in the form of collaborative circle theory. So to kind of introduce you to this theory, it's been used to explain a lot of different cases, which we'll talk about at the end. But I want to just explain two cases, which don't seem to have a lot of parallels. But if you want to explain how both Impressionism and freestyle BMX came to be cultural practices, or say a subgenre of painting and a sport, how they became those things in their own right, rather than just some people who were, messing around and experimenting with, say, different styles of painting light and natural scenes, and people who were experimenting with different styles of flicking their bikes around and like doing flips, so these didn't necessarily weren't necessarily destined to have the cultural impact that they did have. And we'll be using collaborative circle theory to explain how they did have to become such a significant cultural impact and lasting existence. Okay, let's start our foray into collaborative circle theory through the story of Impressionism. So, just to kind of get a sense as to where we're going, Impressionism is a style of painting which, today isn't doesn't seem like anything new, but in the 1800s, this was a revolution in painting. The reason for it, again, we don't need to go into all the details, but it had to do with the way that you painted and captured light. So people would critique this painting on the left at the time by saying it looked like unfinished. But what the Impressionists were going for was a new way of capturing light. So they did that and caused a big stir in the painting scene of the time, and their contributions to art are still relevant today. Okay, but let's back up to before Impressionism existed. And we're going to start with a story of what's called the Salon in Paris, and the Salon des Refusés, so the Salon of the Refused. So again, you don't need to be familiar with art history to get collaborative circle theory. I myself, I'm not any sort of expert in art history, anything like that. What's important to know, though, is that in the mid-1800s, Paris, France, was a center for painting. So if you wanted to become a painter, people would move to Paris because that's where a lot of the teachers were. There was access to studios, and so there were a lot of active painters there at the time. And there were also a lot of regular exhibitions, so opportunities to exhibit and sell your work. And on top of that, not only did you have these opportunities, but Paris, France, was one of the most prestigious places where you could make and sell art. So again, before Impressionism existed, which ultimately had to do with an innovation in capturing light in the medium of a painting, the year in 1863 when of the salon that year, right, people entered their paintings in to have them accepted, and then if they were accepted, they would be judged, and if they were judged well, they could win the salon, right? There were like prizes. And so both of these paintings were entered, and both of these paintings blew people's minds, but for very different reasons. So the painting on the left won first prize in the salon that year. So this one met all of the traditional standards and the kind of expectations of the authoritative the people who were the authorities in painting at the time. The painting on the right was submitted by someone named Edouard Manet. And this painting blew people's minds in the sense that it was very controversial. Looking at this painting today, there's nothing exceptionally controversial about it, and we don't need to really go into all of the reasons as to why these paintings are so different and why some people were so angry and found this painting on the right so controversial when it was shown at what was called the Salon des Refusés, which means the paintings that didn't get into the salon, but we're still given a venue to be exhibited. So yeah, if you're more interested into the art history reasons why that was so controversial, feel free to look into that. But what's important to note is that the painting on the right here was kind of like the Chat GPT of 1863 Paris, France. So some people found it offensive, and some people found it inspirational. And that leads us to the Impressionists. So there were these young painters in Paris at the time, and they found Manet's his contribution, his painting, very inspirational, and they too wanted to innovate and do new things and explore new styles that were sometimes explicitly forbidden by the people who were teaching them painting. So the story is a little bit it can get a little bit confusing because Manet, right, who painted that controversial painting, he's an older and higher status member than the other Impressionists. And somebody with a very similar name, Claude Monet, he's the most famous Impressionist. So he's the one who painted that that blue painting that I showed first. What's more important here is you don't need to memorize the names of these people, but it's important to know that there were a handful of young painters who wanted to do something new. They were inspired by what Manet did, and they wanted to take his kind of rejection of certain standards and conventions of painting. And they wanted to take those further. One last thing before I move on, I just want to say, how did all of these people come to know each other? I already alluded to it earlier, which is that they were all aspiring painters in Paris. And the fact that a lot of people were going to Paris to develop their skills and sell their work at the same time meant that Paris was what Michael Farrell would call a magnet city for the painting as like creative work. And so magnet cities have an important role in explaining cultural innovations because, right, all of these people are going going to the same kind of geographic area. They're running into each other. They are developing their skill. They're developing connections to, right, the older generation. Some of them are getting sick of their teachers and their strict kind of rules as to like how you must create a painting, right? So as those people give each other support in their creative endeavors, they're more likely to succeed, and that's more likely to happen in a magnet city than, say, a rural area where there aren't as many, as you would say, like there isn't a high geographic concentration of painters. So again, just before we move on, what's happened so far is that Manet has painted some controversial thing, and we can call it a cultural object, right? And these painters who are listed here are kind of rallying around it. They're taking inspiration from this cultural object, and in particular, Claude Monet really wanted to outdo Monet's Le Bain. So we had a few projects to complete that. I'm not going to go into detail there, but mostly these people were interacting on a regular basis and thinking about how can we innovate painting as we know it today. Okay, so we're getting into the next stage of which Farrell says groups need to pass through to develop their cultural innovation. So far we have aspiring painters developing their skills in Paris, France, or what Farrell would call a magnet city. They have a common rallying point. They have a common inspiration, which is Manet, who painted who painted that painting and caused such a stir in 1863. And now they're going to break off into pairs and start developing their own innovation. And like Manet, who rejected certain conventions of the day, they're going to reject a convention that has to do with the process of making a painting. And so today this might sound like not interesting, but what these people were encouraging each other to do, and they really needed each other's encouragement to do it because there were so many people and institutions in their lives that were pushing them away from this. But the innovation that they came up with was basically painting outside. At the time, all of the kind of big teachers of the day in Paris said that you needed to complete your work in kind of the controlled conditions of a studio. And so Monet really developed or was pushing people to get outside and paint out in what I believe they call it open air painting, something like that, right? So Renoir and I think a couple other of the people listed here were working with a teacher for many years. Eventually, that teacher started to go blind and had to close his studio, and then that gave Monet an opportunity to convince these painters to come with him to a city south of France, a kind of rural area called Fontainebleau. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Fontainebleau, that's just south of Paris. And so they spent a lot of time outside together painting. And so what's going on when people break off into collaborative pairs, according to Farrell, is that they're developing techniques, new techniques mutually. So like one person might develop some sort of new strategy of painting, light reflecting off of leaves or water, right? But then the next day somebody might tweak it a little bit, and so they're kind of mutually learning from each other, and they're both experimenting together and learning together about what works and what doesn't. And so at first it's Manet and Basile who are paired off and painting together outside, and it's Renoir and Sicily. And then eventually Monet and Renoir pair up, and this is really where the innovation of capturing light, which underpins the Impressionist kind of innovation, this is where it comes from. And so remember the earlier blue painting with that red sun in the middle? That's where we're going in terms of capturing light and kind of the atmosphere, right? Like the impression that a place gives. And just to kind of give a sense as to the work that Monet did there to kind of translate the vibe. Here's like a real picture of the port that he was painting. So obviously there's like some modern things that are going to be different there, but nonetheless, it actually looks pretty similar if you compare them, right? It's got those like crane-like things and the boats and the water. So it's not really all that different. It's probably a clearer day, the day that this picture was taken than the day that Monet was trying to paint. But nonetheless, Monet and Renoir are hanging out together in Fontainebleau. They're practicing new strategies of capturing lights. And then eventually they return to Paris and they start painting outside in the city. So they paint scenes of boats and swimmers and couples strolling on the docks. This is a quote from the Farrell book. And they painted rapidly with short, comma-like brushstrokes. So just to get a bit more into the technique that they're using here. And they juxtapose sharply contrasting unmixed colors. So here's some innovations that if you're familiar with painting that maybe are normal today, but were innovative back then, which painting outside, painting with these certain brush strokes, and painting with using colors in a certain way, like using mixing your paints in a certain way. All of these techniques mixed together enable them to kind of get both the inspiration and do the technical work to, as Farrell says here, bring like a shimmering life to water that no one had achieved before. And that's what's important about Impressionism, is that that's their innovation. They captured light, sometimes on water, sometimes other things, but it's a technique for capturing light in a new way. So when Renoir and Monet came back to Paris, this is literally an example of them standing next to each other, painting the same scene. And so, I'll leave it up to you to make your own opinions about which one, like who is more successful in capturing what it's like to look out at a body of water and have the light like reflecting off of that, right? So I'm definitely not a visual artist, but I can imagine that is very hard to replicate with paints. And so, yeah, you can see here that they were both kind of mutually developing techniques. And yeah, in that stage of cultural innovation, it was through that collaborative pair that they developed. They really refined these techniques, and then they spread out to the other members of the Impressionists. Okay, so at this point in the story, we have painters who wanted to innovate painting. They've succeeded to some degree, right? They have a new technique. Looks pretty neat. I think it looks cool. But now what's important is gaining acceptance among their peers, and especially among the authorities, right? The people who originally rejected Manet all those years ago. And so now we're moving into a new stage in the collaborative circle theory, which is so just to kind of repeat and go through it again. So in the first stage, there's a magnet place. It's a city where people are developing their skills. The next phase, there's a group of people who have some sort of inspiration. They want to innovate. They want to rebel against some sort of convention. The next stage, they break off into collaborative pairs. They develop these techniques. They start to really figure them out and develop solutions to the innovations that they wanted to do. And now they're trying to gain acceptance. And what's important here is not so much the place, right? They're still in Paris, but it's a bit more focused than that. So they have regular meetings for the Impressionists. It was at a place called Café Courbois, and then later Nouvelle Athens. And not only are the regular meetings important, so right, the innovations that Monet and Renoir developed together in the forest and then in the city, not only do those have an opportunity to spread to the other members who are meeting at a regular basis in these places and discussing their work, but it also gives an opportunity for people to step up into what Farrell calls the executive manager position. So this is basically the person who strategizes to get creative work out into the world, because I'm sure if you yourself are an artist or know artists, selling work and like gaining an audience and doing art itself, these are two very different tasks, right? So I've experienced this or encountered this in like, for example, in my research with songwriters. So like songwriters today are exceptionally annoyed that they have to spend so much time on social media, where they're like, I would prefer to get better at playing my instrument and writing my next song, but instead I have to, manage my social media and do XYZ to even just like get by. Whereas I feel like I'm not developing my skills to the extent that I would like to, because I have to do this management thing. So in the case of the collaborative circles and in the Impressionists, right, there's various people who step up who are like, oh, I have experience with this. I can see what he says here, like Basile, he could see the economic realities of life. So he moved into this executive leader position. And which in the case of the Impressionists, that involved organizing their own independent exhibition, because right, the authorities, they didn't find this particularly appealing, and they weren't going to give it a shot, so they had to kind of make their own opportunity, and so they developed their own salon to display their work. And it was the executive manager or executive leader who had an important role to play in that. Okay, so and when they did those independent exhibitions, that is where the origin of Impressionism happened. So up until now, the Impressionists were just a group of painters who wanted to innovate in the medium of painting, right? They met at a common place, but they didn't and they had a new technique that they were working on, but they didn't have like a label. It wasn't like a subculture or something, right, that people were calling them. But when they put out, when they did their own exhibition, which they self-funded, and then critics eventually came and reviewed it. A critic was reviewing this painting, and he was focusing on this painting, but he was making fun of the whole exhibit, and he wrote expressing shock at this like apparently unfinished work. So we can see maybe what he's saying. Like, it looks a little sketchy, but that's what he was going for. So he says that the sketchy figures, the bizarre colors, and these sorts of things provoked the reviewer to both find this work disgusting, but then I guess trying to find something nice to say. He kind of apologized at the end of his review, and he said, "Yes, but the impression is there." And then soon the word was taken up by other critics to make fun of the Impressionists. But then by the third time this group of painters exhibited their work in 1876, they had adopted the name themselves. So they had taken on the label of Impressionists. And so that is the origin of this cultural innovation. Not only did this technique and style exist, but now it had a label. And from that point, they kind of rode the wave and did become accepted. And now we learn about the Impressionists, or you would learn about the Impressionists if you were, say, taking a degree in art history. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so we've already explained where the origin of Impressionism comes from and why it's a cultural innovation, and how these different social arrangements had a hand to play in bringing about this innovation, and in some cases working against it. So the innovation's already happened, but there are still two more stages of collaborative circles, which Farrell outlines, and these are the disintegration and reunion phases. So this has to do with basically the group breaking up. So this can have to do with people passing away. It could be with people moving on and developing a new style, a new thing to explore, returning to their old style. Simply moving away, right? Sometimes people get together, they innovate, they develop something new, and then they got opportunities to work in different cities, right? And so we lose that magnet place, not only in the sense of like the city and then the common meeting area. I wonder how we can update Farrell's theory here in terms of like digital connections and interacting in digital spaces. That could be interesting. But yeah, so basically these people who created these innovations, eventually they separate, and in some cases they reunite for specific purposes, either to just reflect on nostalgia together, or they have a common purpose. So for example, Berthe Morisot helped Monet gather funds to buy Manet's painting after he had passed away, I believe. But they wanted to keep it in France. There was some sort of American purchaser, a museum maybe, I don't know, or collector. And so they reunited briefly to collect the funds to pay for that. So that has less to do with the innovation itself, but this is just kind of like the fallout of innovation, right? Like people's lives don't just end right when there isn't just like a happy ending for happy ever after somebody does some sort of cultural innovation, right? We can even think of like the Beatles and how they broke up and how that was rough for a lot of their fans, I guess, but is nonetheless part of cultural innovations. Okay, so I hope that so now you know that. Now you know the origin of the Impressionists, and now we're gonna move on to another example of freestyle BMX. So I'm just gonna throw over to a clip from a documentary that's on freestyle. It's on the city where people really developed freestyle BMX. And to kind of give you a preview of the ending of the story, there are two people who are exceptionally good, who both work together in the city, and had a lot to do with the development of not only the techniques that are important to freestyle BMX as like a trick-based sport, and some people would call it an art. It's kind of like figure skating or something like that, right? Like it's a performance sport where you're jumping around doing tricks. You can be judged on it. But right, to just kind of jump to the end, right? There's this cultural innovation, which is freestyle BMX, and the fallout has to do with its growth as a sport. So these two people who had a lot to do with the development of the practice, their relationship falls apart because they become I don't think they're angry at each other or anything, but they become competitive. They're the two best BMXers in the world, and so they're inherently competitive, and so their kind of partnership, their collaborative pair, disintegrates at the end. But they have achieved a huge amount of success in the world of sport. So anyway, let me throw over to that documentary, and we'll come back and talk about it. Sorry, one last thing. So the documentary clip, it's going to start, and it says the seed for a scene has been planted, and that basically just means there'd been this new park that had been like a new skate park that BMXers were also using in the city.
The seeds for a solid BMX scene had been planted. Then, in the spring of '94, a newcomer arrived from upstate New York that would change the Greenville scene forever. That new rider's last name was Mira, but not the Mira that you're thinking of.
I was not really riding as much as I used to, only because it was kind of tough with work and trying to get around and find places to ride. I was dating a girl at the time, and her family relocated to Durham, North Carolina, and they asked me if I wanted to come. I was about 21 years old at the time. Had nothing to lose, figured I'd go try it out for a couple of months. If it didn't work, I could always go right back to Syracuse. It worked out, and then she ended up happening to get into ECU in Eastern North Carolina. So then when she relocated to ECU, we ended up getting an apartment together. It was probably after we got everything moved in and everything settled down. I was bored one day, kind of pacing. I had my bike with me, but I looked out the window and I'm like, what is that over there? So I walked through the trees there, and across the parking lot was a fenced-in skate park, and I couldn't believe it. So right away I got on the phone and called Dave. I said, Dave, you're not gonna believe this, man. There's a skate park right across the street from where I moved. And I told him I still could not believe it, that of all the places I could have moved in this town, right outside my front window.
Once Tim found the park, it was only a matter of time before he became a fixture of the Greenville BMX scene, and it was also a matter of time before his brother came to town.
Dominique Toretto, je prends de ta famille.
I put a new headset in my bike, was practicing getting the headset broke in, and this guy walks up and he says, hey, you ride a bunch? And I was like, yeah, who's this guy? I was like, yeah, I ride a lot, and he goes, well, maybe you know who my brother is, Dave Mira? I was like, yeah, I know who your brother is, but this is in '94, so previous to the X Games, if you were on a BMXer, you had no clue who Dave Mira was. So I knew this guy wasn't pulling my leg. He wouldn't have just pulled that name out of a hat. So we started talking, and of course that was Tim Mira. He said, yeah, I just moved here, and my brother's talking about maybe coming down to visit. I told him there was a ramp in my backyard. So I got excited. I said, Dave Mira, there's a chance Dave Mira's coming to my park. So I built a spine ramp and a sub box next to the box jump. So then we had a total of 4 ramps at the park.
So every day after school or whatever, I would usually go out to JC Park. And one day I went out there. There was like this pudgy Guido guy rolling around in the parking lot, and I didn't really get a good look at him. I was like, oh, weird, somebody, like I figured maybe a college kid brought out his old BMX bike or something, and he just hauled across the parking lot and did like an enormous flip over the little jump box, and I was just kind of like, what in the world is going on?
And I was like, Dave Mira is at my park. I cannot believe this. At the time, in '94, you had the pro class consisted of 7 or 8 guys. So to have Dave Mira riding my local ramp that I had built with my hands, in my backyard basically, it was just like, no way.
When Dave got to Greenville, he was in heaven. The JC skate park was literally across the street from Tim's apartment, and there was a tight crew riding every day having the time of their lives.
December 18th, 1993, I got hit by a car in Syracuse, so I was out of commission pretty much most of 94. So I wasn't riding. It was crazy. It turned into just a party up in Syracuse. I came down a couple times. I said, "Wow, my lease is up March 95. I got to get out of Syracuse." Dude, I had this rider truck packed up a couple days before March, arrived, and I was like, "Dude, that's it." It was a super rainy day, whatever. I didn't look back for months. It was a small scene, but you got to understand, I came from Syracuse where we didn't have any place to ride, and then come down here and I could ride every single day. It was like, wow. It changed me. It changed me as a rider, and I say the whole move to Greenville for me was a career saver, without a doubt.
It would be comparable to a kid that was into basketball having Michael Jordan show up and practice with him every day. I mean, you couldn't help but get better. You were there riding with one of the top guys in the sport. He's showing you pointers. We're riding together. We're feeding off each other, and it was just like a dream come true.
It seemed like when Dave moved there, the bar definitely was raised for everyone who was already there, because rather than seeing someone do a nice 360 or whatever, now you had this guy spinning his bars in the middle of a 360 and doing huge flips, and just like, out of nowhere he would just turn it on, and it would be like you were watching something on TV, and this was like, your friend. And as new kids started to ride, one of the top 3 riders in the world was like, what they saw every day as their standard.
So yeah, in that clip you saw similar kind of dynamic to what was going on with the Impressionists. So hopefully you could hear what they were saying over top of the the music of the time, and also apologies for the guy who used the unfortunate word for Italian, but yeah, anyway, so you can see here similar dynamic. These there's a magnet place, right, which is sort of surprising. It's not maybe the magnet place that you would expect, like Paris, France, or maybe New York City for hip hop, or Toronto for Canadian pop music as well. But it's a bit isolated compared to those cities. It's not a big city, but nonetheless, it has this park, and it has Dave Mira and Ryan Nyquist. So these are 2 of like the best riders in the world at the time. And in Hugo Corte's article, he takes Farrell's theory, and he did actual interviews and some participation observation in Greenville with these riders, and did interviews with them. And so he saw how a regular part of this Greenville skate park / BMX park was to do what they called hard trick sessions. So they would do kind of build their way up to these harder and harder tricks, and then push each other to be able to accomplish them. And like that guy said in the video, right, like you have one of the best people at this thing in your backyard. So being able to just like see that person and interact with them, it changes your standards, and it enhances your capacity to achieve that same thing too, right? Because you can get some guidance from them, and right, like in the way that Renoir and Manet were exchanging. Renoir and Monet were exchanging insights about this technique for capturing light on water. Dave Mira and Ryan Nyquist were helping each other, and the other riders in the Greenville scene to develop their practice of doing freestyle BMX. Okay, so let's summarize collaborative circle theory. With the benefit of going through these 2 examples of the origin of Impressionism and BMX freestyle. So, as Farrell says, there are 6 stages of collaborative circles, and as I mentioned earlier, right, once they get to number 4, once they've gotten through number 4, they've gained acceptance for their cultural innovation. before then, they're people who are just kind of developing a dislike and something to for some sort of convention or something to rebel against, right? And they develop their own techniques, but those only really matter if they become accepted and catch on. Other than that, then they just were something that person did. It didn't have a social consequence in the way that the Impressionists did in the world of art. So they need to go through these stages, right? Formation. What's important to that stage is the magnet place. Rebellion. They need something to rebel against. They often also need what Farrell calls a collaborative, or sorry, a charismatic leader. So somebody who inspires the members of the group and can also probably, and is also maybe a bit further along in their career or in their capacity to do this creative work, in the way that Manet was, older, higher status, and just simply a better painter than the Impressionists at the beginning, at least, right? Before they had fully developed their capacity and their techniques. Moving from rebellion into this quest creative work stage, right? We see the importance of collaborative pairs. Moving beyond that, we see the collective action stage, where there's a new role that emerges that's really important, which is the executive manager. So the person who can actually figure out how to link these innovations into the economic system where people are buying art, and also link it into the system of like prestige and critical judgment. So that's an important stage there. And then once and if they succeed at this collective action stage, then they've done the innovation, right? They've succeeded in contributing some sort of cultural innovation. And this is rare, right? I think that it's worth noting that people and groups can go through the first three stages and even work towards the fourth one without ultimately achieving their goal, right? I'm sure there are many different forms of cultural innovation, which we don't know about because, right, they didn't get through the end. And then, like I said, the last two stages here are kind of inevitable outcomes and a common pattern that Farrell found among his case studies. Okay, so just to close out our module on collaborative circle theory, like I just alluded to, Michael Farrell uses collaborative circle theory to explain other cultural innovations. In his book, he explains the emergence of psychoanalysis. So there's actually a surprisingly similar story with the emergence of Freud's theory of psychology and, all that. There's actually a surprising connection to collaborative circle theory. He had a mentor who was really important, which could have been, or this relationship, the Freud's relationship with his mentor, can be considered similar to the way that Manet and Renoir's relationship contributed to their innovation, and the way that the Dave Mira and Ryan Nyquist's relationship contributed to the development of BMX freestyle. He also explores the Seneca Falls Convention. This is one of the first kind of formal meetings on women's rights in North America. And so he connects collaborative circle theory not only to kind of cultural innovations in the arts and science, but politics and how they're also relevant to social movements. And he also goes through poetic and literary innovations. Thinking about the Canadian context, I know from just, I guess, gossip from academic conferences that Michael Farrell did start and has data on the Group of Seven, and how that group of painters may also serve as a case of collaborative circle theory. We can think about Toronto as the city, maybe the magnet place where they met. Right, I don't have the story fresh to my mind, but I believe they worked for some sort of company that was based in Toronto. And so that was kind of, so Toronto was their magnet space, but nonetheless, obviously they're traveling to isolated areas to do their paintings. So maybe it's a little bit different in the terms of like how does travel influence the relationships among members of these collaborative circles. So that's something that's worth thinking about if you're interested in art history. I think it's also worth thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, like how does digital communication technologies help force us to rethink how collaborative circles are going to form and influence culture. I think especially now in the wake of the COVID pandemic, a lot more people are just comfortable hanging out online. I don't know about you, but I remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, right? I had like done video chats and meetings online and stuff, but it was an exception. And now and we would like comment on how weird it is or whatever, and now it's just like totally normal. So I think that's going to influence how collaborative relationships unfold. I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you have them. But that's it for this lecture. Remember, the main kind of takeaway points are how collaborative circle theory explains cultural innovation, and David Byrne's thesis, creation thesis. So the fact that we kind of create for our context. That's it for this module. Now we'll take a few minutes to talk about the first assignment. Okay, so a lot of people are afraid of what ChatGPT is going to do to the academy and academic assignments. I'm not too concerned at this moment. And I think even if, the kind of doomsday concerns are valid, taking, the non-normative approach to culture, ChatGPT is a tool. People are going to use it. Not going to be able to fight too much against it, so let's just incorporate it into the class. And so I do expect you to do some original writing of your own. It's built into the assignment, and so yeah, I expect you to do that. So to complete the assignment, you'll use ChatGPT to generate a sociological research proposal explaining the origin of a musical subgenre. Okay, so we've already talked about this, like the difference between a genre and a subgenre. These aren't absolute, category differences, but I think there needs to be a level of particularness, right? Like in the way that hip hop is a musical genre, like conscious hip hop or trap, or mumble rap, right? These are all subgenres because they're within hip hop, but if you're going to call something mumble rap, right, that has a particular connotation to it. And so, right, this exists across other types of culture. So if you're kind of adverse to doing a musical subgenre focus for this assignment, I'm open to other subgenres. Just feel free to reach out, send me an email, and we can chat about it. Send me a few ideas as to the subgenres you're planning to look at. But we'll go through the different steps of this assignment. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them along or post them to the discussion board. But first, you're engaging with ChatGPT. So think about ChatGPT as your research assistant. You want to learn about the origin of a genre. We've spent all day, all of the module today, talking about how collaborative circle theory explains cultural innovations, right? And that includes the origin of subgenres. So we can think of, the origin of mumble rap and how that maybe it could be explained using collaborative circle theory. So nonetheless, step one, you got to make a ChatGPT account and log in there. And for this assignment, you need to enter at least 2 prompts. And I know that sometimes ChatGPT will kind of not pick up on the fact that you're trying to get it to do the same thing again. So if that happens, just you'll have to restart. But so you're going to get it to generate either 2 or 3 full research proposals. And how you do this is first, your first prompt is going to be write me a sociological research proposal on the origin of blank. Insert musical subgenre here. So, these are examples. So you do that, it'll spit something out, read it, think about it, be like, it'll spit something out really general too. I've experimented with it a little bit. And so it'll say something like, I'm going to do interviews and surveys on the origin of this genre, right? And so I want you to do at least one and maybe even two prompts to refine the research proposal. So you need to say something like, okay, do that research proposal again, but this time use collaborative circle theory, or focus on the local context where this was made, right? Like if it's I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but of a subgenre. What's it called? Grime, I think. Grime is like a kind of UK variant of hip hop. And so, say for example, you typed in, write me a sociological research proposal on the origin of grime, and it says like, oh, it's a hip hop subgenre, and it originates in the UK, and so I'm gonna do interviews with the originators in the UK, and then a survey of listeners. That's kind of a thing I've noticed. It kind of says that. Anyway. So from that point, you can say either, I would suggest to either like tell it to focus on doing a survey, or sorry, and remember, like if we're focused on like what's the origin, we want to understand the origin of this thing. Do people who listen to it today really matter if we were trying to explain the origin of a genre? No, we want to go back, and so try to come up with some prompts to like get it to focus more on like what's the actual social origin of this music genre. And so try to come up with one or two prompts to get it to do that. Once you do those, the original prompt plus the one or two additional ones, copy and paste that, or like print it to a PDF or whatever, save it for later. But look at that final one that you had it print out, and now you are, I give you the permission to give grades, and you're giving grades to ChatGPT. So give it a grade out of 100, right? Think about like, it's giving you a research proposal. Could you start working? Like, could you do this research proposal? Like, how much does it have sufficient detail for you to be like, oh, okay, I know who my first research participant would be, or like I know like there's a few options for research participants, and I can reach out. I could like literally send them an email, like or send their representation an email or something and ask them for an interview. Like, obviously you don't need to do that for this class, but thinking about like how good of a research proposal is this? Give it a grade out of 100. And taking that role of like teacher, then write a description as to why you gave it that grade. What I have listed here on the assignment instructions is, in the 300 to 500 words, I want you to describe your process of interacting with ChatGPT. Like, what was it like interacting with it when you put in a prompt and asked it to revise the research proposal? Were you impressed with its capacity to revise the proposal, or were you disappointed? Right? These are like the human emotions that go along with collaborating with ChatGPT, and I want you to reflect about that. And so, do you think it's a good research assistant? That's kind of part one. Why did you give it that grade? That's part one of explaining its grade. And then part two is referring to specific things that it did. So referring to that conversation that you printed out, refer to specific things that it did well. What did it do? What was like very precise and like was helpful for maybe even like starting this research project? And what are points that are vague and could be improved, if any? That's the writing component there, which I do want you to write originally, is to assign a grade and write the 300 to 500 words on your reflection of interacting with ChatGPT and why you gave it that grade. So that'll be the start of the assignment. And then append your interaction with ChatGPT. And so, yeah, the grading criteria I have outlined are it's 85% for content. So you followed all the instructions, you did all the components, you asked GPT, you got it to generate at least 2 research proposals. The grade that you gave it made sense. You're not giving it, 0 for doing a decent job, and you're not giving it 100 for doing like a decent job either, right? So think about that. If it is perfect, and you do give it 100, you should have a strong reason as to why it couldn't do anything better. And the final 15% is for structure. So this is, just kind of like style, grammar, flow of writing. If I'm having to do work to kind of piece together what you're trying to say in that 300 to 500 words, then you can lose points there. Okay, so with that, I wish you the best on starting the assignment and thinking through collaborative circle theory. I'm interested to hear if you have any intuitions about perhaps cultural innovations where we could use collaborative circle theory to explore and explain where these cultural innovations came from. All right, and with that, I'll wish you a good rest of your day. Take care.